Let me come to Ellen Sana now. And Ellen, you have been very, very engaged in, I don't know for how many years now, in advocating for the rights of migrant workers, ever since I've known you. And that seems to be a very, very long time kind of thing. And I've seen that a large part of your work has focused on women migrant workers as well. And in your own experience today, and as you look back, and I know you've been now you're even preparing, I heard this morning, a shadow report for for CEDAW and things like that. So you have seen this, you have struggled with it, you have engaged government with it, and particularly your own government. So in many ways, where the rest of the world looks at Philippines as a standard bearer for rights and protections and things like that, you have been constant in pointing out gaps and vulnerabilities and challenges, while you recognize some efforts have been made as well in terms of protection. So, what are your thoughts on this situation, particularly when it comes to women migrant workers, and where states respond to vulnerable situations of my women migrant workers by banning? Let's put a ban. Let's stop the deployment because they are very vulnerable. How do you as a women's rights activist, migrant rights activist, take to that view, and what kind of uh, alternatives then do you propose, Ellen?
Hi, William. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to share with you on the GCM 7, that is Objective 7, that is addressing and reducing the vulnerabilities in migration. And I think, William, the words were carefully chosen to address and reduce. So, meaning it's not like there is hope that they will be totally eliminated. And let me address that as I go with my presentation. I drafted for the first round so that I will meet the 6 minute time. So let me start. The GCM was adopted end of 2018, but before we had time to even draft our respective ambitious national response to the GCM, here we are already being challenged with the COVID-19 pandemic, which impacts on all of us, with migrant workers as one of the hardest hit sectors as well. Can the principles of the MICIC, migrants in countries in crisis, whose context was more political conflicts and wars than health pandemics, combined with the GCM objectives, stand the litmus test posed by the COVID-19 pandemic? In particular, can we address and reduce the vulnerabilities of migrants per GCM Objective 7? Pre-COVID times, migrants are already considered a vulnerable population because while, and this is my elaboration in this, is while their human and labor rights remain intact in our being, the laws and policies that express them are not always present where they are working and living in, and where this exists, these policies and laws, effective implementation will always be a challenge. ILO estimates in 2017 put migrant workers around the globe at 164 million. 68 million of these are women migrants, or 41%, noting a 9% increase in the last 4 years from 2013 to 2017. Migrant domestic workers numbered 11.5 million, with women domestic workers comprising 8.45 million, or 73.4% of all migrant domestic workers. In the case of the Philippines, 56% of our migrants in 2019 were women, with 62, like I repeat, 62.5% in domestic work. These women migrant workers are disproportionately vulnerable to abuse and exploitation because of the nature of their work, more so under COVID times, the migration channels they go through, and overall low regard of society for domestic work, which is performed primarily by women migrants, an occupation which is hardly covered by labor and social laws, undervalued and recognized unrecognized, informal, precarious, and because it is a woman's work. That said, measures and initiatives have been undertaken to address and reduce their vulnerabilities at all stages of the migration cycle, I must add. For example, apart from national policies to protect all migrant workers, and this is the case in the Philippines, there is a set of policies that seek to protect particularly migrant domestic workers at all stages of the migration cycle. For example, recruitment agencies are prohibited from collecting placement fees from prospective migrant domestic workers. This way, they are not supposed to end up in debt bandage. Part of the protection, also, quote unquote, regime is that they must go through recruitment agencies because we have a law that puts the recruitment agencies in the Philippines and the foreign employer in joint and several liability relationship. On site, our laws provide for social welfare attaches where there is high concentration of women migrant workers. We also have a gender focal point officer to ensure in this that there is gender responsiveness in the responses of the post. And this is under the Magna Carta of Women in the Philippines. Upon return, there is also reintegration package exclusive for low-wage domestic workers. Needless to say, policies and programs are in place at all levels of governance, from national to local, guided not only by national laws but by ILO 189 on decent work for domestic workers, where the Philippines is a party to, by General Recommendation 26 and the entire CEDAW Convention, ILO 1 Convention 190, and the CMW, of course, to cite a few of these normative framework. And yet, our women migrants continue to be vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. Why is this so? One, gaps in access to information of migrants and prospective migrants. For women in rural areas and far-flung areas where illegal recruiters and as unscrupulous elements thrive. And this is very much so in the case of the Philippines, which is archipelagic islands, so they can easily isolate themselves in the islands far from the town centers and urban centers. Gaps in accessibility of programs and services, and even the appropriateness of some of these programs and services too. More often than not, these are concentrated in urban centers, not enabling and there is no enabling environment for women workers to access such. Lapses and gaps in coordination between and among service providers, line agencies of government, missions, and the mother offices in the capitals. Effective implementation, monitoring, and even evaluation of policies, programs, and services are very much wanting too. Strong push factors for women to migrate for work because of poverty, but also because they end up not in the labor force in their own countries, like in the Philippines. Like 55% of our women workers are not in the labor force because they have to do the unpaid care work in the households. So they think that the better option is to leave the country. But they, of course, they ended up doing domestic work, the same work, but this time it is paid care work. What do we do? We have in CMA, one of the things we are doing is this building and strengthening the network of support for women migrant workers. Just this early afternoon, we had our online convening in Mindanao area. So we had like 66 participants combined from local government, national government, and migrant organizations in attendance. And we are all together in trying to build, strengthen, and expand the network of support for women migrant workers. We conduct capacity building on migrants' rights, gender and migration, social costs of migration, and equipping them, how they can be of help to their distressed migrant constituencies. We engage in information and education work. I think we must not get tired of reaching out to the communities to engage with them on migrants' rights issues. We assist migrants in organizing their ranks. What are the challenges that we have experienced? Desperation of a job, this is our observation, sometimes or oftentimes actually wins in the end, and takes the better of them or the worst of them, of our women migrants. That is how they know the perils of it, but then they will go just the same. How to engage the migration narrative? This is another challenge, from one out of desperation to one where migrants are needed by countries of destination, and where migrants have options to stay because there are decent jobs available for them in the country of origin. For the latter, I am not optimistic at this time. Actually, have not been for a very, very long time, for sure. It is very sad that you can actually hear now in the Philippines when the migrants are back in the country that, oh, they will be competing for the jobs in the country, in the Philippines. And we thought that this is only, that we only hear it in the countries of destination when the local workers there would think that the migrants are stealing their jobs from them. But now we are hearing also, and I hope this doesn't become the narrative in the months to come, that the migrants who have been back in the country are going to be competitors of the workers, the local workers in the countries. Yeah. So that's one thing. Okay, let me continue. Also, another issue, another challenge is to develop and offer more job options for women. The usual response of government to abuses against migrant women is to stop the deployment. Evidence has it that this does not work. What can work is when women workers have equal opportunities for decent jobs back home. Yeah, maybe that's one way to effectively discourage them from taking the migration option, but they can only discourage. And the other part is, but the main challenge is also how society in general regards women and women's work. That women have agencies, that they have capacities just as any other beings. That household work must not only be the domain of women, but by all members of the household. And I think I end my first round of intervention. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for that. I think you raised some very good issues there, but I will ask you to do some introspection on your own reflection, kind of thing, and the way you have positioned migrant workers and women migrant workers and the question of domestic workers, do you think now there is a plenty of hope in the air, kind of thing, largely because the world has come to recognize in this COVID how important domestic workers are, because now they have a new category. They are called essential workers, or they fit within the essential workers category. So is this a great thing that has happened for domestic workers, and is the world going to change for them coming out of COVID, kind of thing? I'll put that question for you to think of. The other question I'll put for you to think about is do you think vulnerability is attached to the fact that your Philippines is a country of origin? The power dynamic between the desperation of a country of origin to deploy workers, does that is that a part of the design into which vulnerability is built because of the power differentiation and negotiation, the desperation that workers have to leave the country and look for overseas employment, that desperation causes or attracts vulnerability or breeds vulnerability is something I want you to think about.